I am also a proud alum of the UC Center Sacramento program. I was here just last year as an intern for the office of Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom. Now our governor, so I did a really good job. uh, don't tell him I said that. Um, anyway, in all seriousness, it was a wonderful experience, and I'm happy to be back here today. But now to introduce Dean Johnson. Dean Johnson joined the UC Davis Law Faculty in 1989. He was named Associate Dean for Academic Affairs in 1998 and became Dean in 2008. He's taught a wide array of classes, including immigration law, civil procedure, complex litigation, Latinos and Latinas in the law, and critical race theory. In 1993, he was the recipient of the law school's Distinguished Teaching Award. Dean Johnson was a magna cum laude grad of Harvard Law, where he served as an editor of the Harvard Law Review. He earned his AB in economics from UC Berkeley, graduating Phi Beta Kappa. After law school, he clerked for the Honorable Stephen Reinhart for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and worked as an attorney for the international law firm Heller, Ehrman, White, and McAuliffe. Dean Johnson has been published extensively on immigration law and civil rights. His book, How Did You Get to Be a Mexican? A White-Brown Man's Search for Identity, was nominated for the 2000 Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. His latest book, Immigration Law and the U.S.-Mexico Border, received the Latino Literacy Now's International Latino Book Awards Best Reference Book. He's a regular participant in national and international conferences and has held leadership positions in the Association of American Law Schools. He's also the recipient of an array of honors and awards. He's quoted regularly by the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and other national and international news outlets. Dean Johnson has served on the board of directors of Legal Services of Northern California since 1996 and is currently the president of the board. From 2006 to 2011, he served on the board of directors for the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, the leading Mexican American civil rights organization in the United States. Dean Johnson is also an elected member of the American Law Institute. I could fill the whole hour talking about Dean Johnson's accomplishments, but at this time I would like you to please join me in welcoming Dean Kevin Johnson.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for that overly kind introduction. Even though it was overly kind, it's still very much appreciated. I want to talk a little bit about immigration today. And I thought about immigration both from a sort of a scholar's standpoint, but also from sort of a policy standpoint as well. And I've worked with a number of organizations over time on immigration policy matters. And one of the cases that I've worked on that I think was most satisfying in a lot of ways was a few years ago when I worked with the State Bar of California and represented the State Bar of California in getting a law license for an undocumented immigrant named Sergio Garcia and helped change the law in the state to ensure that undocumented immigrants might be eligible to practice law. A little aside, when I was asked to work on that case, I was told two things. One, it wasn't going to take a lot of work, and two, it was a sure loser. And in the end, both of those things turned out to be exactly wrong, which actually I'm happy about that things all worked out. But as you all know, and probably why many of you are here, immigration law and policy is one of those issues that's deeply dividing this country. And we have a government shutdown now that's precipitated in no small part because of President Trump's insistence on congressional funding for a border wall. I could spend the rest of our time, and I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions and answers, but I could spend the rest of the time telling you why a wall wouldn't deal and wouldn't address many of our issues when it comes to undocumented immigration. Because more than half of the undocumented immigrants in our society didn't cross without inspection, but they entered with legal visas. If you're talking about a wall, assuming that a wall would work, it would only deal with roughly half the undocumented immigrant population. In many ways, and I think people are exactly right in saying that the wall is more of a symbol of something as opposed to an effective immigration enforcement measure. I'm not going to go into detail on this. I'll assume that you believe me when I say that President Trump has taken an aggressive immigration enforcement position. And I can go through all kinds of stuff that he's done. And what I want to focus on today is the state and federal tensions that have resulted from his immigration enforcement measures. And that's what my focus will be on federal power versus state power when it comes to immigration. I'm not going to talk about, or in any detail about, although I could if you pressed me in question and answer, about the issue of executive power versus congressional power when it comes to things like the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, which provided temporary relief for hundreds of thousands of young undocumented people. But I want to, and I'm not going to talk about other executive actions the president has taken, like with respect to eliminating temporary protected status for Salvadorans, Hondurans, Nicaraguans, Sudanese, and Haitians. I'm going to focus more on sort of the conflict between the federal government and the state government when it comes to immigration enforcement. I'm going to end by saying, to me, this tension, all these issues about immigration, really what they militate in favor of is some kind of immigration reform in the Congress of the United States. You might call it a comprehensive immigration reform, but we certainly need some kind of immigration reform that deals with the undocumented population that's here, that deals with legal immigration, and also deals with enforcement. What we've been seeing in recent years is a lot of talk about more enforcement measures and not a lot of talk about some other related measures. But before I start talking about state-federal tensions when it comes to immigration, let me sort of review some basically undisputed facts when it comes to immigration. I guess President Trump might dispute some of them, but most other people wouldn't dispute these facts. And one of them is that currently today we have about 11 million undocumented immigrants who live in the United States. Roughly 20 to 25% of them live in the state of California, and about 9% of California's labor force is comprised of undocumented immigrant labor. All sort of reliable studies show that the undocumented immigrant population has been relatively stable in the last few years. It went down after the recession of 2008, some. It went up a little bit after the economy started recovering. But before and after 2008, there's roughly 11 million undocumented immigrants who live, and many of them work in the country. Second undisputed fact, and I think Democrats and Republicans would agree on this, the current enforcement measures under our immigration laws haven't resulted in a decrease of the undocumented population. Lots of money, lots of legislation, a lot of action has been taken in the last 25 years when it comes to immigration enforcement. Before the early 1990s, there weren't large-scale operations along the border, enforcing the border. There wasn't much of a border wall. Now there's more of a border wall, maybe not as much as President Trump would like. A lot more, as President Obama would say, boots on the ground when it comes to immigration enforcement. A lot more detention facilities in place designed to deter undocumented immigration. But what we've seen is not a decrease in the undocumented population, but we had roughly an undocumented immigrant population of about 5 million in 1994, and we have an undocumented immigrant population today of about 11 million. So even though all these steps have been taken, billions of dollars have been spent over many years, we've seen an increase, not a decrease, in the undocumented immigrant population. And this might be disputed some, but most knowledgeable scholars would say that increase in undocumented immigrant population has occurred because of the demand for undocumented labor. So if you just focus on border enforcement, immigration enforcement, and don't deal with the demand for labor, you're going to see what we've been seeing is an increase in undocumented population. Another undisputed fact, undocumented immigrant population workers can be found, this is going to sound stupid, they can be found in the agricultural industry, in the service industry, in the construction industry. And the demand for low-wage labor in those sectors attracts undocumented labor. This doesn't really relate to my talk, but I always want to say it. Another, among scholars at least, another undisputed fact is that every reliable study that we have out there shows that immigrants commit crimes at a lower rate than native-born U.S. citizens. There are some bad things that happen. Undocumented immigrants commit crime, like the general population commits crime. I can't deny that. I wouldn't deny that. But if you look at overall numbers, the immigrant population has a lower crime rate, and that's been very consistent over long periods of time. And actually, there's been some. I think the New York Times had an op-ed recently that said, "Well, if we want to reduce the crime rate, we should allow more immigration into the country." Another undisputed fact that gets very little attention but bothers me a lot, because I've spent some time along the border, working, talking to people and working with nonprofits. Deaths are a regular feature of the U.S.-Mexico border nowadays. There's roughly a death a day. Our enforcement measures in places like El Paso and San Diego, in the big cities, is rerouted immigrant streams through deserts and mountains where they're more likely to die. In Pima County, Arizona, in the summer, they often don't have enough refrigerated facilities to store all the bodies. It's an incredibly sad story that most Americans don't pay attention to. But one of the things that our immigration enforcement policy has done is rerouted people to places where are more likely to die and where they are dying on a regular basis. Another undisputed fact is that every so often, in the last 50 years, we've seen an increase in the number of asylum seekers from Central America. In the 1980s, we saw an increase in asylum seekers from Central America because of civil wars occurring in those countries. President Reagan adopted some policies to deal with the in his view, mass migration of Central American asylum seekers. One of the policies that he adopted was detention and putting asylum seekers in detention facilities. Actually, one of the first cases I worked on involving immigration involved a challenge to detention policies where a lot of Central Americans were being detained in a place called El Centro, California, arrested in San Francisco, where they could get pro bono attorneys if they wanted to, but they were detained and transferred to El Centro, California, that has no pro bono attorneys, where they weren't able to get representation. And so the Reagan administration used detention. President Obama was dealing with a Central American problem, in his view, and he started detaining families together a few years ago, and had to figure out a way of addressing, in his view, the problem of large numbers of Central Americans coming here. And President Trump has also experienced what he's characterized as a crisis of Central Americans coming here in caravans and overloading our asylum system by exercising their rights to apply for relief that's available under our laws to apply for asylum. Now, these are all basic, undisputed facts Now, different presidents have taken different approaches when it comes to immigration enforcement. President Bush, the second President Bush, used workplace raids. He had a large raid in a place called Postville, Iowa, at a poultry processing plant there, where roughly 500 Central Americans were working there and were criminally prosecuted. Actually, their immigration proceedings, as well as their criminal proceedings, were conducted in a cattle corral in Iowa. But President Bush used raids. He also used these agreements with state and local governments called 287G agreements. It relates to a particular provision of the Immigration Nationality Act. It allows the federal government to enter into agreements with cities and states, in some states, to get the state and localities to assist the federal government in enforcing immigration laws. One sort of famous 287G agreement was between the U.S. government and the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office in Arizona, which is headed by a guy named Joe Arpaio. Joe Arpaio used all his authority as sheriff to focus on immigration enforcement and try to remove undocumented immigrants from American society. He was also enjoined by a federal court for engaging in racial profiling in violation of the Constitution. He was also sanctioned for hiring a private investigator to follow the judge's wife. So he was kind of a colorful figure, but I use it as an illustration. Sometimes if you have the federal government working with the state police, you got to worry about some possible civil rights consequences in some circumstances where the local police don't work so well with the Latino community, and that was one. But President Bush used these 287G agreements, worked with state and local governments, and he had a relatively conventional removal policy, nothing that extraordinary there. And I have to say I didn't agree with President Bush on quite a number of things, including Guantanamo. But he did seem to have a rational approach to immigration, very conventional one, and in a lot of ways. President Obama, he was a supporter of comprehensive immigration reform, and it might surprise some people, but he deported more immigrants than any president in United States history by a large number, roughly 400,000 a year for his first term in office. And actually, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, now the President of the University of California, was in charge of that removal campaign, Janet Napolitano. And President Obama, his goal in increasing removals was, if I can show the Republicans in Congress that I'm committed to immigration enforcement, they're more likely to pass comprehensive immigration reform. He's a supporter of comprehensive immigration reform, so he focused on enforcement, and he did a number of things that are actually quite extraordinary. He had this program called Secure Communities, and it required state and local police departments to share information with immigration authorities about non-citizens who were arrested on basically all crimes. All crimes. So that means somebody who is arrested, we're not saying guilty or convicted, we're saying arrested. You're arrested for driving without a license or a DUI or a relatively minor crime. The Secure Communities program under President Obama wanted state and local governments to provide that information. And one of the ways that we had record numbers of removals during the Obama years was because of the close state and local cooperation under some mandate from the federal government. There was a lot of disputes between the federal government and state and local governments during that time that I'll talk about in a minute. So President Obama set these removal records. He also set records for the number of immigrants detained during his time. Well, rightly or wrongly, I don't know if he's proud of this, but President Obama still holds the records for the number of people deported per year, because President Trump hasn't deported nearly as many as President Obama did. And President Obama also detained more immigrants than any president in United States history. And he used, as I mentioned before, family detention, detaining entire families together as one of his ways of deterring people from migrating. Now, during the Obama administration, we saw some state and local responses to the Obama administration's immigration policies, and they were quite varied. Some states, like Arizona, South Carolina, and Georgia, passed laws to facilitate immigration enforcement. They wanted the federal government to do more in terms of removing people. They said that Obama wasn't removing enough people, and they wanted to do things like require police to check immigration status when people were pulled over, to require state and local police to turn people over to the federal authorities, to be able to punish under the criminal laws undocumented immigrants working in their jurisdiction. Now, I'll talk about these state responses in a minute. That was one set of state responses. Another set of state responses, actually, was more at the local level at the time. A number of jurisdictions began declaring themselves as sanctuary cities, saying that we aren't going to cooperate with immigration and customs enforcement. We're not going to work in terms of deporting people from the country. And some of those cities had very good policy reasons why they wanted to be separate and apart from federal immigration enforcement. If you're a local police officer trying to protect the public, you want to work with the entire community to get people to report crimes, to participate as witnesses in trials, and to work with police. If immigrants, part of the community, aren't comfortable going to the police because they think if I go to the police I may end up getting deported, then they're not going to cooperate with the police in reporting crimes, going to court and testifying crimes, or working with local police. So some police departments, like the Los Angeles Police Department, which isn't known to be particularly sensitive in any way to the rights of people, they have a policy that limits LAPD inquiry into somebody's immigration status. So they don't ask suspects their immigration status. They don't ask witnesses their immigration status. They don't ask anybody their immigration status. If somebody's convicted later on, then the immigration status may become relevant. But in the initial interaction with police, under Special Order 40 of Los Angeles Police Department, they don't ask about immigration status, and then they have that policy and they're express about it. LAPD doesn't declare itself to be a sanctuary police department. They say that it allows for effective law enforcement. It's an effective law enforcement policy because they have a lot of people in the community, immigrants, who if they don't trust the police aren't going to go to the police, and that's not going to help anybody. So at the time of the Obama removal campaign, you have some states saying the administration's not doing enough. They need to deport more people. And they have some jurisdictions saying they're doing too much. We should provide sanctuary and limit our cooperation. Now, the Supreme Court, in a case called Arizona versus United States in 2012, held that the Arizona law, SB 1070, went too far when it comes to facilitating immigration enforcement. The Supreme Court emphasized that immigration enforcement is really within the power of the federal government. State and local governments shouldn't generally be involved in immigration enforcement. The state and local governments can only be involved in immigration enforcement to the extent allowed by Congress in the Constitution. Generally, states have other things to be interested in, and so most of Arizona's SB 1070 was struck down, and now we have some fairly clearer rules. And here are some of the clear rules, and they come into play when it comes to President Trump's immigration policies. The clear rule now is that the federal government is exclusively in charge of which immigrants to admit to the United States and which immigrants to deport from the United States. California can't have its own immigration admissions policy or its own deportation policy. I might want to have my own admissions policy. I might say, no Texans allowed in California. We're not going to permit any Texans coming to the state. Sorry if I insulted anybody. But we don't allow states to regulate who can come into the jurisdiction. We make it clear that's something for the national government to take charge of, and the national government makes those decisions. And to the extent that other countries might get unhappy with our immigration system, they go to the national government for discussing that. To the extent that the federal government makes those decisions, the federal government is accountable for those decisions. And so when it comes to the immigration system, it's very clear states can't have their own immigration restrictions. States can't regulate travel between the states. What the states can do, and what they do on an ordinary basis, is states have what lawyers would call police powers that they can exercise to protect the health, safety, welfare, and morals of residents of their state. And we see, criminal laws. Most criminal law are designed by the state to protect state residents. We see the state providing a public education to benefit the residents of the state. But these state police powers, they're designed for all residents, separate and apart from immigration. And at the same time, state and local governments have to worry about, well, how do we integrate all people who are residing here in our jurisdiction? The federal government decides who can be admitted, who can be deported. We have to decide how we make sure that our society is as cohesive as we can make it. And you can think of things the state can do when it comes to immigration issues. A state can generally say, we're going to allow undocumented immigrants who graduated from a California high school to pay in-state fees at California University. We're going to allow undocumented immigrants living in the state to get a driver's license. You might say, well, what's the benefit to the state and to the general public by allowing undocumented immigrants to get a driver's license? Well, I had 3 kids, and they all got driver's licenses. And I'm not necessarily sure that I'm convinced that driver's licenses ensure safety of drivers. But the idea is that if you license people, they get training, they get tested, and the idea is that they'll be better drivers. Maybe more importantly, if you're licensed, you can get liability insurance. And all of us benefit from having as many people on the roads as possible having liability insurance. So the selfish state of California argument for allowing undocumented immigrants to obtain a driver's license is that it protects our citizens. It ensures that people driving on the road, and we know that there are undocumented immigrants who drive on the road, have safety training, have safety testing, and are more likely, not everybody who has a license gets insurance, but they can be punished if they don't have liability insurance. And so that's why a driver's license law is, it allows undocumented immigrants to get a driver's license is permissible, and why a law like AB 540 that allows in-state residents to pay fees is permissible. But laws like Arizona's Deport 'em All law isn't permissible, because that's something that the federal government does. Now, California had three laws that were recently the subject of a federal court ruling, not that far, just a few blocks from here. And it was a case brought by the United States government against the state of California, and the then Attorney General Jeff Sessions came out here to announce the lawsuit. And he had a press conference where he started. Actually, I watched it. He started off by saying how California had some great attorney generals, or some great leaders who became Attorney General of the United States, including his good friend Ed Meese, who was the Attorney General in the 80s, and none of the young reporters there knew who he's talking about. But in any event, Jeff Sessions announced this lawsuit, and there were three laws that he was challenging. Three laws that were part of what President Trump has said are sanctuary laws, and some of them, the California legislature said they were sanctuary laws. One of them was AB 103, and that directed the Attorney General to inspect and issue reports on detention facilities in the state, not U.S. government detention facilities, but local government detention facilities, private detention facilities, because what the federal government's been doing in recent years is contracting with like Yolo County, Yuba County, some other counties to get bed space to put immigrant detainees. So this provision does require the Attorney General to inspect these facilities. Judge John Mendez, George Bush appointee, said that doesn't intrude on the federal power to regulate immigration. That's just telling the state's just protecting its citizens and residents, making sure the detention facilities are safe. So that's not unlawful. Another law that was challenged was a more general law, SB 54, sometimes called the California Sanctuary Law. And that limits the sharing of information by law enforcement in the federal government, by state and local law enforcement in the federal government. And basically, state and local governments have said, you only have to share information to the extent that federal law requires that you share this information. You go exactly to the limit of federal law and not beyond that. And Judge Mendez said, well, that doesn't intrude on the federal power. That's saying that federal law governs and it doesn't disturb federal law, and states don't have to go any further than is required by law. That was upheld. There was one law that was found to be unlawful, and that's AB 450. And that law restricted employers from voluntarily cooperating with federal immigration enforcement authorities. And Judge Mendez said, well, that does directly affect federal enforcement power by telling private employers when they can cooperate. So that one does intrude on federal law. So the court entered an injunction there. What we see, I talk about a lot of other cases, but what we see in United States versus California, as well as many other cases, is the state and federal governments now are trying to figure out where the line is between the federal immigration power to admit people and deport them and the state power to protect its residents. We're likely to see more laws like this because this is such a hot button issue, and we're likely to see more challenges to these laws. I think in the end, one of the interesting things to me as President Trump and Jeff Sessions attacked sanctuary cities and state and local involvement in immigration matters, one of the interesting things is sort of we're seeing a real change in the arguments in the sort of the 60s, 50s and 60s. State and local governments and many people who supported segregation basically said, federal government, you should stay out of this. It's none of your business. We don't want any interference with states' rights. Now, and it's one of those people is Jeff Sessions, claiming that the federal government shouldn't be involved in civil rights. Now you have and had, now he's not the Attorney General, but Jeff Sessions was criticizing state and local governments and saying there's no there's no states' rights here. This is a federal issue, and you should get out of it. It shows that a lot of these issues, when it comes to federalism and state-federal power, they really can change over time depending on the particular substantive issue in question, whether it's the civil rights laws or whether it's the immigration laws. So it's sort of an interesting irony. Now, I think it's likely we're going to see a lot of these fights for the near future until we see some kind of action by Congress dealing with immigration reform and sort of the set of issues that people find to be difficult to deal with. And now, since we don't even have an open government, it seems like it's going to take a while to deal with them. But let me stop there, and I'd be happy. I've given talks in a number of places. I remember early in my career, I gave a talk in Dallas, Texas, at the law school that I'll go unnamed. And the first question I got was somebody in camouflage fatigues with an American flag who asked me, "What part of illegal don't you understand?" I know you'll be much more congenial than that, but I'd be happy to take questions.
Could you comment on